So let me introduce Andy. Andy is the principal with Premier Incorporated with more than 20 years of healthcare consulting experience, specializing in acute, primary, post-acute, and senior care services. He's a nationally recognized expert on post-acute care. Many of you will remember Andy from previous events through LeadingAge and even have engaged him privately within your own organizations. His expertise includes strategic planning, acute and post-acute integration, provider network development, managed care, and so much more. Please help me in welcoming Andy.
Last night, I was headed to the airport. My wife was coming home from visiting. My eldest went to college last year. He's now in his sophomore year. My parents, who I've used for examples forever and a day about living on a 4-level house, experienced 3 deaths in the family in the space of 4 weeks in February. And on the 2nd of March, my mother called me on the phone and said, "Your father and I are selling the house. They've lived in for 33 years, and we're building a new house, and we're going to live next to your sister." And I went, "That's awesome," because my sister self-selected herself as the adult caregiver. And my mother was in the emergency room 3 days ago, and my sister was there. So it was pretty awesome for that. But I got to go through the process of helping my folks develop a real senior-friendly house. So it's all 42-inch doors, it's grab bars, it's the whole 9 yards. My mother was astounded at how much change was going on, and they just moved into the house 2 weeks ago. And so my wife got to go down, see Joe at school, our oldest, plus visit her parents who are celebrating their 47th wedding anniversary. And then she got to see the new house. So I haven't even seen my parents' house. My wife has seen it. She's sending me pictures of it. And on the way home, she says to me, as I'm going to the airport, she says, "Where are you going again?" I said, "I'm going to Michigan." She said, "Yeah, where?" And this is where I know I've been here way too much, because I said, "Well, if you take out your right hand, honey, and you look at this little spot right here." And she said, "Hey, that's pretty handy." I said, "You have no idea." So I know I've been here a lot and talked with a lot of you about things. There are some things, maybe if you remember from you participated last summer, I may have touched on a couple of these things. If you were here, I think it was 3 years ago, I came and talked to the Leadership Institute as well. The arc of change that we have been talking about for the last 6 years as it relates to aging services, as it relates to elder care, keeps advancing. In fact, if anything's happened really in the last 18 to 20 months, it's the pace at which these things are coming at us that has really ramped up and accelerated. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about some of the things that are thinking from a broad perspective around post-acute, around legislative and ACA or healthcare reform-related things that continue to impact us in the aging services space, and why really in the last 18 to 20, 24 months, why the hospitals and health systems are suddenly like, "Hey, wow, post-acute. Like, I never heard of post-acute before. What is that?" And what's driving their thinking there. I want to talk a little bit about the advancing construct around population health and what a number of us contend is the real, true emerging opportunity for us in the aging services and elder care space. One of the things we talked about this morning, and Vicki referenced it, and I think we'll talk about it more in the panel today, is the issue around relevance. How do we remain relevant as long-standing providers of elder and aging services care when there is so much going on around us that is coming honestly from outside of our industry? So how do we adapt? How do we change? So I want to talk a little bit about some of those things as well. So I think what is interesting about this particular comic from Dan Ferraro, who writes this particular illustration series called Bizarro Comics, is just the nature of where we are in this information loop, that it just seems to keep coming and going back and forth constantly. We're on this infinite loop of change. Change is the hallmark of our industry. I made the point with a group this morning, when PPS hit us in the nursing home industry, almost 20 years ago at this point, it was the end of the world. And yet, we managed to survive and be wildly successful at it. So much we're making double-digit margins on Medicare. Now they want to change the system again. We're going to move to bundled payment. We are. And there's no question it's going to challenge us. We'll succeed in that space too. Inevitably we will. It's going to be painful for a while. There's no question of that. But the nature of how we succeed in that space, in all honesty, is really going to hinge on how we work with one another. I know a lot of you have heard the words around collaboration, consolidation. All we have to do is take a look at what's happening in the payer space, what's happening in the acute hospital or health system space, the nature of consolidation, people coming together. We need to look at those constructs and think about them as examples for us in this space if we're going to be successful. So when Laura had called me on the phone and said, boy, what do you want to title this? What do you want to title this presentation, which is always a question I hate. Boy, what was going through my mind? Well, you know, the nature of value-based payment and the nature of change in healthcare around payment, because most of the thinking in healthcare changes, delivery reform or payment reform. We're really out to lunch yet deciding whether or not delivery reform, things like ACOs or shift in management is really going to be a driving force. There's no question that payment is going to be a driving force, and that is a giant black hole. So when we start thinking about the nature of black holes, it's a question of whether or not we're going to get sucked into that black hole and crushed, because the truth is, there are too many post-acute organizations in our country. There aren't too many aging services organizations. We probably can't build enough to support that space, honestly. But there are too many nursing homes. There's too many home health agencies from the perspective of a lot of payer organizations, which is why they're being more picky. It's why they're being more selective in this environment. And so the question really becomes, how do we manage that inevitable force of value-based payment as we start looking towards the future? And so when you talk a little bit about black holes, as a stellar construct, as an astronomy construct, the nature of a black hole is a large gravimetric force that sucks in light and everything around it. You can't resist it. Even light can't escape the gravitational force of a large black hole. And on the edge of a black hole is this construct that scientists call the event horizon. It's the point at which there is essentially a point of no return. Once you cross the event horizon, you're going to get sucked into the black hole. And most people agree that if that happens, guess what? You're going to get crushed. So the question really becomes for us is, we have to figure out how to navigate right up to the event horizon in this equation without getting sucked in. In the morning, Vicki, you posed the question about when's the date coming? Vicki asked, I want to know what date exactly happens when value-based payment will happen and there's no turning back. And I would tell you there are two dates that are significant to that. One was last January, in 2015, when CMS said we're accelerating the path to value-based reimbursement. And the second one was July 9th of 2015, a year ago last summer, when CMS announced the joint mandate, CCJR, the Comprehensive Care for Joint Replacement, the 90-day joint replacement bundle mandate, which essentially said this is no longer a voluntary construct, bundled payment is here and going forward. Just 4 weeks ago, yeah, it was 4 weeks ago, they announced, sorry, it's 3 weeks ago, they announced the next round of mandatory bundles. Plus there are mandatory bundles emerging for oncology as well. And we'll talk a little bit about those. But this shift towards bundled payment is not going away. And if you look at even what, say, for instance, Paul Ryan has posed as a reform to Medicare, and what we can expect potentially a Republican administration would do around healthcare reform or the ACA, most of the thinking around episodic payment and alternative payment models, it's all in there. It's not going away. And more importantly, so much of the commercial industry has shifted in this direction. So how do we navigate this edge and be successful and not get sucked in, not get crushed? Because there are a lot of people in this industry, and I'm not necessarily saying people in this room, but there are people in our industry who aren't going to survive these changes because they're not big enough, because they can't get to scale, because they can't make the investments in technology or staff it's going to take to remain relevant. Those of you who've been in this industry at least 5 years, if not 10, 15, or 20, and a lot of you in this room have 20-plus year careers in this industry, have been witness to some pretty dramatic change, right? That's not changing. We're going to continue, and the pace is only going to accelerate. So how long can we skirt the edge? There are 5 big things that at a high level I just want to use as a setting to set the stage to talk about some of these things. The first one is the nature of consolidation. Consolidation keeps expanding across the country. Hospitals and health systems come together, large payer organizations coming together. The FTC, the DOJ, has tried to get in front of a couple of those. They've been shut down. In effect on the FTC side. And so mergers are continuing to move forward. Why do hospitals and health systems, or why do large systems come together? Well, it's really not about efficiencies, because when you bring 2 large organizations together, they're not going to become more efficient, certainly right out of the gate. What they're after is lives. They're after coverage. They're after geographic scope. I want more lives, because if you have more lives, that drives more volume, ultimately, to the key drivers of revenue for your organization. Hospitals depend on physicians to refer business to them. Most of us don't self-admit to a hospital. So how do you keep a hospital fluid? You have as many physician relationships as possible. How do you become successful, honestly, as a hospital or a health system in the environment going forward in delivery reform? It's all about docs. It's all about primary care. And I would say for us in the elder care space, the nature of our relationship with physicians has to change because of that. And they are undergoing their own forms of consolidation. So consolidation's happening all around us. It doesn't appear to be slowing down. As I alluded to already, value-based reimbursement is coming faster. CMS stood up in January 2015 and they said, you're not moving fast enough, we're pushing the pace. So the intention is that by 2018, which is literally from a fiscal year perspective, right around the corner for us, starting on October 1 of next year, half of the payments made to Medicare fee-for-service organizations must be made in some alternative, what we call an alternative payment arrangement. And right now that means bundles. So you think about that as, say, for instance, a nursing home organization that gets a lot of your revenue in fee-for-service per diem basis. Are you prepared for 30 to 40 to 50% of that now being in an at-risk payment? Most of us are not. And it's literally right around the corner. So that pace around value as a focus for defining payment keeps increasing. Systems keep getting bigger, bigger and bigger and bigger as a result of consolidation, as a result of acquisition of physician practices largely. Interestingly enough, they're still not buying post-acute. They want to partner with post-acute, but they're not buying it. The first conversation I've had literally in 3 years was last week, which was with a group in upstate Pennsylvania who said, hey, our ACO, I thought this was fascinating, our ACO wants to buy a nursing home, but the hospital leadership doesn't want the ACO to buy a nursing home. What do you think we should do? And my response to that was, don't buy the nursing home. You don't need to own the nursing home. You can leverage an incredible amount of value out of that nursing home, but you don't need to own it. So this thought about continuing to get bigger and bigger and bigger, I said jokingly in the elevator on the way down here this morning, as we continue to consolidate across our industry, at some point we're probably going to have 3 to 4, 5 major corporations or major organizations in this country that control 75 to 80% of the total healthcare market share. It's a likely inevitability. Is it going to happen tomorrow? No. Could it happen 7 to 10 to 15 years down the road? Yeah, it maybe could. So things keep getting bigger and bigger. And in that environment, as aging services organizations, we need to think about how do I remain relevant in that kind of shifting space. Finally, for outsiders are the organizations that are driving innovation and disruption in our healthcare system. Most of innovation in American healthcare right now comes from outside healthcare providers. And a lot of the innovation that's transpiring in elder care comes from outside providers. So, Walgreens is a large pharmacy organization, developed one of the first commercial accountable care organizations. Why in God's green earth would a pharmacy get into accountable care? It's a great question. You know who probably knows more about the nature of your health care than anybody else in your community? If you're the typical person and you see a primary care physician, you see a specialist for somebody else, maybe you see a chiropractor from time to time, maybe you get some PT, odds are most of us get our scripts filled at one pharmacy. Your pharmacist probably knows more about the nature of your health care than any other single provider. Because guess what? All the data's in one place. The pharmacist who helps my family, in particular my daughter who has reactive airway asthma, has avoided 2 major pharmacological interventions for us over the course of the last 5 years. Because Todd looked at the scripts and said, she shouldn't be taking these 2 medications together. And he gave us a good rational reason for why that was, which is we'll end up back in the hospital again. To which my question was, where the hell is my doctor in all of this? Pharmacies know a lot. They have data. They have information. Data remains to be the gold standard in this environment. What's also fascinating is all the technology. And we've talked about technology before. Earlier this year, I had an opportunity to present at NIC at the National Investment Center, and I was on the panel with a gentleman who who's part of Formation Capital. He has this essentially seed pool of money called Aging 2.0, and they take, it's essentially like Shark Tank for elder care. They take innovative ideas, people pitch them, and then they back them. And so the latest thing that they were on was really, it was kind of interesting, which was essentially a belt that a senior wears that has sensor technology so that if the senior falls, it inflates an airbag all around them and cushions the fall. To which I was like, hey, that's great. He said, yeah, we're really excited about it. I said, who picks the senior up after they fall? And he looked at me like he hadn't thought about that. And I wasn't very popular there for a couple of minutes. We don't come up with ideas like that, but we have the ability to create application for those ideas. So it's understanding how we can impact in that environment that's really key. And then finally, and you're going to hear this a lot from the panel we talked about this morning, and I've already alluded to it, post-acute and elder care are very, very hot issues right now, largely because we spend a lot of money in this space and more organizations are at risk for this money. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those issues. So healthcare continues to be this complex array of madness. There are so many things going on. It is impossible to keep track of all of them. I live in this world on a daily basis. I can't keep track of them. The only things that you really need to keep track of, honestly, as aging services providers are two things. One, how is payment reform ultimately going to impact my behavior? Whether it's private pay, whether it's managed care, whether it is fee-for-service shifting to value. Payment reform is probably, I would say, the biggest thing we need to pay attention to. After that then becomes the quality and regulatory issues. But you don't need to worry about the nature of an accountable care organization. You don't need to worry about the comprehensive primary care initiative. You don't need to worry necessarily yet about clinical integration or worry about clinically integrated networks. That'll all come to us inevitably. What we need to focus on are the things that have immediate impact to us from an operational perspective and an immediate strategic perspective. And so much of that is tied to quality and skill set and payment, because at the end of the day, what drives our ability to be successful is payment. And CMS knows that, the payers know that. So we come back to this construct, the triple aim, where we're going in this equation. The last several years have really held out this idea that if we can achieve three basic things, we can change healthcare. This is going to take decades, decade and a half, maybe two. Honestly, I think it's going to take 25 years. Whereas if we can deliver better care at the right place in the continuum for the right price, inevitably the system gets better. So we talk all about right care, right place, right time, and I contend what goes into that is the right price. And the issue right now around hospitals and health systems as it relates to is this issue around right price. Why should I pay one nursing home to manage a patient who does it for 21 days, and the same type of patient goes to another nursing home and that nursing home manages it for 13 days? There's a reason that happens. We don't understand that reason very effectively yet, but hospitals and health systems look at it pretty clearly. 13 times an average Medicare payment is X, 21 times an average Medicare payment is Y. If X is less than Y, guess which one I pick? I pick X. For those of you who've heard me talk about the nature of value-based lawn mowing in the past, it's really a question of if I can get comparable quality for a lesser price, what ultimately am I going to buy? I'm going to buy lesser price. So the argument is what? Quality. It's all about quality. And you know, the nice thing about quality is that if we deliver better quality, if you reduce readmissions and better quality, what happens to cost? It goes down automatically. Automatically. So when we start talking about lower cost, I think the thing that oftentimes we lose sight of is people say, you know, are you expecting me to push my cost even down more? No, not necessarily. What I'm talking to you about is helping you understand how your behavior impacts total cost for the individual in an episode of care or in a defined time frame. So much of this is focused on what people want to talk about, population health. How do we get to this construct of population health? We'll talk a little bit about this, but it's really about how do we focus on broad group health issues rather than individual issues. And there are a lot of things that drive population health in our country. A very, very good friend of mine is the Director of Integrated Care Management for a large ACO in Indiana. They have about 300,000 lives at risk. Most of those are commercial lives. And they were doing a study internally around primary care office visits. And what they had determined is that they had an absentee rate approaching 30%, which essentially means 3 out of every 10 people going to a primary care office visit were missing the visits. That's missed utilization and missed opportunity. It also can potentially translate into unmanaged issues that represent higher costs down the road. So they dug into those. What's the leading cause for a 30% absenteeism rate? Guess what? Transportation. You know what the leading causes of bad health care in central Indiana? Lack of a good transportation network, which has nothing to do with health care and everything to do with a social determinant of health. I had the opportunity to sit in the audience about 8 months ago and watch 5 of the leading population health organizations in the country talk about what their biggest focus was going to be for the next 24 months. It was all social determinants of health. It wasn't clinical management. It wasn't hiring more docs. It wasn't clinical integration. It was about how do we address social determinants of health? Transportation, housing, nutrition. What are the things we do in aging services? transportation, housing, nutrition. The opportunity space for us in population health is enormous if we figure out how to capitalize on that space. So the value-based leaders, those thinking about population health, those thinking about the nature of change within our healthcare system are really focused on 5 things. How do we stratify a population? Because not everybody is the same. How do we care manage that population? Because all of the money, truth be told, if you want to be a person who makes money in a volume proposition in this environment, it's all in care management. How do you manage that population as it's stratified? 3, how do you grow out palliative care, the construct that is palliative care, as opposed to spending untold dollars on unnecessary acute procedures? How do you really effectively use palliative care to manage chronic illness? I'm not talking about hospice care, I'm talking about palliative care. They are not the same thing. And that's a big, big issue for a lot of people that they don't understand. Palliative care is about managing a person who has a complex chronic condition or potentially has a terminal illness or a condition that inevitably is going to lead to their decline because everybody's facing that prospect in one form or another. The question is, do you really need to have a major intervention that's going to benefit someone financially but does not contribute to quality of life for the person long term? That's a tough thing to sell in a fee-for-volume environment. When you're living in an environment where every time we go through the turnstile we get paid, the nature of saying, I'm not going to take payment for this, I'm going to manage this person to quality of life. That's a big shift in a financially oriented thought process. Finally, then there's post-acute service development. How are we engaging with those providers who are really immediately after this? And then 5th, this evolving space around community integration. How do you partner more along the continuum to not only address post-hospital, post-care, but preventative management and the social determinants of health? And that, I contend, is the opportunity space that we need to be thinking about in this particular environment. So, why is post-acute under so much scrutiny right now? Well, it's about the nature between fee-for-service and the nature of value-based healthcare. We live in a fee-for-service world. We like a fee-for-service world. The nursing home in particular, it's fabulous. The upside has always been, and I feel bad about this to one degree or another, because when the OIG for Medicare a year ago came out and said, guess what? Payments to nursing homes have gone steadily up for the last 5 years, but the relative acuity of patients in the nursing homes has not changed at all. Why does payment keep going up? I'll tell you why. It's because consultants and lawyers and other professionals have taught all of us how to optimize the MDS in such a way so that we account for all the ADLs appropriately and we're getting what we feel is entitled to us in caring for an individual. We've figured out how to make the system work best to our advantage. We're maximizing the revenue opportunity. We've reached a point now where that's bad. Now we want to go the other direction. And value-based is all about those individuals who can lower length of stay. So, heads and beds in fee-for-service equals revenue. Now in the future, head and bed may not equal revenue. Could represent a loss if you're not managing to length of stay. If you're not dealing with the length of stay that Priority Health comes in and says this patient will be here at for this amount of time, you are not potentially an ideal partner for them. Don't expect that that sort of thinking is going to go away, because it's not. The nature of value-based care is right place, right time, right care, right price. And we're really in this evolving process of determining what those are like. The nature of value-based care is pushing risk down to us as providers. Because if we carry the risk, we can change our behavior more. The only way you can change the behavior of a teenager, honest to God I believe, is if you take the car away. And the only way you can change the behavior of an 11 to 14-year-old is if I take the phone away. In retrospect now, I should have never given them phones. Because the data overage charges are killing me. And most of you know what I'm talking about. So, this is the acceleration in this direction. Historically, we've been all fee-for-service. There's been very little impact on payments linked to alternative models or payments for quality. Only 20% up through about 2014 and 15. We're growing, so we get to this point by 2018 where half the payments are coming in some alternative arrangement, and that ultimately means a bundle. There are 2 other big things that are impacting us in the post-acute space from a legislative standpoint. One is PAMA, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, which essentially really establishes the value-based purchasing program for skilled nursing facilities. And what that really means is value-based purchasing has to be budget neutral. So what they'll do is their goal is to shift payments from the whole system from lower quality providers to higher quality providers. How do you do that? Well, you make a rate cut is what you do. You take 2% off the top, put it in a pool somewhere, you evaluate everyone on the basis of quality, and if you're a high-performing facility, you're going to get a portion of it back. What's the definition of a high-performing facility? Remains to be seen. But knowing that SNF value-based purchasing is coming. And then finally, there's the IMPACT Act, which became law in 2014, which really is focused on deriving standardized care assessments and creating a pathway towards site-neutral payment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about site-neutral payment, but the goal of MedPAC, and CMS has toyed with this idea for years, is that there are 4 discrete payment systems in post-acute care right now. One for us in SNFs, another for home health, another for acute rehab, and another for long-term acute care hospitals. They all get paid in 4 entirely different ways. And that creates all sorts of challenges because one patient could be effectively treated in 3 out of those 4 settings. And a lot of the data shows that 100, 150 days out, a patient treated for a typical procedure in a home health agency, a SNF, or an acute rehab has roughly the same outcome or functional status at 150 days. So if I'm at CMS, I'm asking the question, why do I pay an acute rehab $18,000, a nursing home $9,000, and a home health agency $3,000 to do what they're all, to do essentially the same thing? So we're going to go to site-neutral payment, which means the site doesn't determine the payment, the diagnosis determines the payment. And in that environment, that's really just a big bundle. And so we have to figure out how will we operate in that environment. Now, I will tell you that environment is probably 10 years away. The integration, the planned implementation of site-neutral payment doesn't start honestly kicking in until 2023. So it's 7 years away at this point. But the ACA was just passed 6 years ago, which just feels like a blink of an eye to me. And we've undergone a lot of change in the last 6 years already. So it will happen faster than we realize. The legislative changes are out there. Why is all this important? Most of you probably know this. 4 out of 10 people discharged from hospitals go to post-acute care. The bulk of those, 8 out of 10 of those discharges, go to SNF or they go to home health. So those are the hot spots. Of the $78 billion we spent in post-acute care last year, most of that money, $62.5 billion or so, we spent in SNFs, we spent in home health agencies. So they're the big spender categories. And the issue with that is this fabulous report that was created by the New England Journal of Medicine a few years back that essentially looked at all of the spending variation in Medicare across the country. So they said, let's consider a baseline performance. Let's look at all 306 of the hospital referral regions, and we'll say from a baseline, what's the most expensive spending location geography-wise? What's the least expensive? So the top one is $450 above the norm. So in Dade County, Miami, on average, they spend $450 more per month on Medicare beneficiaries than they do in the baseline. $180 below the baseline is Billings Clinic in Billings, Montana, where patients are managed very, very effectively. So that's a big span, $630. Where's all that variation? Well, it's not in hospitals, and it's not in drugs, and it's not in outpatient, and it's not in docs. It's all in us. It's all post-acute, and that's what's got people wound up. Because if you take post-acute care out of the mix, you remove 74% of the variation in spending, which we get back to, why does the same patient 40 days in one facility, 27 in another, and 13 in another one? Yeah. Part of that is the challenge historically of a per diem payment system. If we can skill out the patient, we're going to figure out how to get paid for the patient. Why that is a big deal is as we shift from per diem or fee-for-service thinking and we move to episodic thinking, suddenly it becomes very, very apparent to us where all of the spending is tied up in an episode of care. So this is a stroke patient, and the size of the bars represent the total amount of dollars, not time, dollars spent in that episode. So this much in hospital, this much in doc, this is readmissions. Most of the spending in a stroke episode, a 90-day stroke episode, is tied up in post-acute care. Why? What do stroke patients need to be functional again? Rehabilitation. That takes time, costs money. Hip and femur procedures, same thing. What hospitals have figured out about the joint mandate, when you're looking at an average episode price around the country for a 470 of about $24,000, the hospitals are already pretty efficient with their component of it. They've done, usually in most markets, it's the single largest or the second largest volume procedure done in hospitals, total joint replacements, MSDRG 469 or MSDRG 470. They've done it for so long and so much of it, they have it right down to the geometric mean length of stay. They're doing it really efficiently. So if I'm looking to save money and I'm at risk for a 90-day bundle, where am I going to take the cost out? I'm going to take it out in the highly variable component. I'm going to take it out in the nursing home. Because most orthopedic surgeons do not understand why their hip replacement patient is still in the nursing home at day 22. Why is that happening? So the emphasis here is all around managing post-acute. There's virtually no post-acute care services in cardiac, so everybody who's interested in developing a cardiac specialty program, I'm here to tell you, there's not a lot of opportunity in cardiac specialty programs. There is for congestive heart failure, but not for LVADs. I worked with a nursing home group in New Jersey a few years ago. It was all hot about the fact that they had developed a care pathway and clinical excellence to deal with LVADs, left ventricular assist devices. You know how many LVAD admissions they get in a year? 2. Because people are lining up out the door to get LVADs. They don't happen very often. But yet that was sexy and exciting, and they wanted to go after that. Heart failure, same sort of thing. The problem with heart failure is readmission-related issues. So how well you manage the patient afterwards. So why does all of this matter? Well, it matters because we're moving here, which is to bundled payment. We're going to take all the redundancy out of the system. We're going to take the administrative complexity out of the system. We're going to remove multiple payment lines and multiple payment systems. We're going to take the risk away from the payer organization, and rather than everybody else individually everybody else sending a bill and the payer footing the risk, we're going to move away from this in favor of bundled payment. So the payer provides a single payment intended to cover all the costs and episode of care, typically to one individual who's going to bear the risk for it, and then that person negotiates or haggles with the other providers to figure out what their portion and share is going to be. Now, the way this works in most models right now is there's a degree of gain sharing opportunity. So if the target is X and you're under the target by a certain portion, you get to keep a portion. Of course, you have to pay a portion back to CMS for the joy of being able to participate in their mandate. But there is gain sharing opportunities in these environments for providers who can actually demonstrate better than improved performance. So, most of you, how many of you in this room have heard me talk about value-based lawn mowing? So, we've moved to a new development in my house. It's called the bundle allowance model because I am sick and tired of being an ATM. Because anyone in this room who's had teenagers or preteens is well aware of the fact of, Dad, can I have $10? Gets really old after a point in time. And my kids, all 3 of them, they all get an allowance, but the expectation is within that allowance, there are certain tasks around the house you must do. A friend of mine in college said the only reason he would ever have children is if he could train them at as young enough age as possible to go get Dad a beer out of the fridge. That doesn't happen in my house, but the expectation Melissa and I have is that they're going to do the dishes and they're going to take the garbage out and they're going to learn some accountability in that environment. So most of you who've heard me talk about this before know that I have 3 kids, Joe, Jack, and Molly. My oldest went to college. Jack's going to be a sophomore this fall. Molly's going to be an 8th grader this fall. They go back to school in, God, what is it, like 10 days. That's where Melissa's going to be the mom standing in front of the garage jumping up and down. Have you seen those pictures? First day of school pictures. So historically, there's a definition or division of labor as it relates to these 3 kids. So Jack and Joe have always split mowing the lawn. That changed when Joe went to college. Now it's pretty much all on Jack. Joe's always done the garbage. He's dealt with cleaning bathrooms, which is apparently the province of being the oldest kid in the house, and he has to mow the lawn. Jack ultimately and Molly are supposed to alternate doing the dishes, which is akin to cats fighting in a bag. And there are days we really want to throw them into the river. They're both accountable for feeding the cat. Somehow I would like to get to the point where they are both accountable for the litter box of the cat. But that seems to be one task I can never get rid of. And then Jack's mowing the lawn, and Molly has now migrated to being accountable for the garbage because she's just not strong enough to push the lawnmower up and down the hill, which Jack thinks is a bunch of crap. And we get into long-winded discussions with my teenagers about the nature of modern feminism. Just shut up and mow the lawn. So I'm funneling money at the 3 of these like crazy, which is fine. I don't mind paying my kids an allowance. The problem is that we've never really been good about allowances paid on a certain day. You should pay 12% back to Dad for the privilege of getting an allowance. Because the one year at Halloween, I took a portion of their candy. Melissa said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm teaching about federal income tax." I never got to do that again. So I got tired of doing this. So about 6 months ago, right before Joe came back from college for the summer, I said, we're going to change the nature of how we do the allowance in this house. So here's what I'm going to do. The net value of the allowance weekly in my house right now is about $40. It's not a lot of money, but I'm tired of shuttling it out. So I just said, here's the deal. I'm going to put $40 out on the table. You guys figure out amongst yourself who's going to do what. I have the expectation that it's going to get done. If it doesn't get done, all of the allowance is going to go away. But you guys figure out who's going to do what. I don't want to deal with the crap anymore. Here's the money. Okay? So they're at risk for getting stuff done. So bundle allowance services is a predetermined payment for all allowance-related services. So dishes, taking out the garbage, cleaning the bathrooms, feeding the cat, and ultimately mowing the lawn. The providers determine who's going to do what ultimately in this equation, and they're going to negotiate amongst one another, totally up to them, about accountability and price. Well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Now, in this model, someone has to hold the risk. Collectively, they'll hold the risk, but I'll tell you what has happened. A facilitator has emerged in this equation as the person who is essentially dealing out the equation. There are only 2 of them left in the house. Guess which one has emerged as the facilitator? My daughter. So, I give the money to Molly. And Molly negotiates with Jack about what to get done. She's actually gone so far as to, because she comprehends value-based lawn mowing. She's actually gone to the point of telling Jack that if he didn't do a good enough job cleaning the bathroom, she's not going to pay him the whole amount. Which is a pretty funny argument to watch happen in my house. Melissa is like, why are you doing this to them? And a close friend of mine, Nicole Fallon, who works at Larson Allen, when I showed her this slide, she said, your children must hate you. And I said, God, I hope so, because then I'm doing the right thing. So what's happened in this equation is Molly gets the money. Molly is ultimately paying Jack in this equation. Jack really doesn't care as long as he's got some cash flowing in. Now, this probably isn't going to work once he starts with a job at some point next summer when he turns 16. You have to be 16 to work a part-time job in Minnesota. Now, here's the upside of this. I usually don't have a lot of cash on hand. Most of us, I think, anymore. I mean, how many of you actually carry a checkbook anymore? We do everything with debit cards. I rarely carry cash. So when the pizza guy comes from Domino's to deliver a pizza and you want to give him a tip, I don't have any cash. Melissa doesn't have any cash. Guess who's got cash? Hey, Molly, can I borrow $5? Now, because this is a bundled payment, and because Molly's gotten really good at this, and because I'm just greedy as a payer and I can do this, I've instituted a shared savings model, which essentially means she's got to return a portion of the savings to me because I'm the payer organization, and she's emerged as the facilitator. She's actually making more now on her allowance than she was making before, because guess what? She controls the money in this equation. So he or she who takes the risk in bundled payment, ultimately, is the person who's going to control the money. So when you get to prospective bundles, and we're not there yet, it's going to be a hospital, it's going to be a health system, it's going to be a payer organization, who ultimately is going to say to you in that equation, I will pay you X for this rendered service. I might give you some upside gain sharing opportunity in this environment if your performance meets a particular level. And because Molly's doing such a great job in this, I don't mind necessarily that she's getting more money in this equation. Joe, because he moved out of the market, doesn't have to participate in this particular bundle. And I tried integrating him back into the summer, but that didn't work at all. We just kept it with the other 2. Bundled payment is everywhere. This is the adoption rate for BPCI, the Bundled Payment for Care Improvement Initiative. That was the voluntary bundle that was put forth in 2011, the end of actually 2012, for people to the option to participate in it. The nationwide march to bundles started last July 9th, when CMS announced the CJR, the Comprehensive Care for Joint Replacement. It's currently underway. It's in 67 markets across the country. Most of the hospitals participating in this are in the Bay Area or Los Angeles in California and the New York, Newark MSA. The rest of them are spread around the country. There are 2 participating MSAs here in Michigan. There are none where I live in Minnesota. And what CMS did is they went out and they identified traditionally high-cost, lower-quality markets as the focus area for it. It is strictly focused on lower extremity joint replacements, 469 and 470. So hips and knees, what is traditionally volume business for us. It's typically the ones we can rug out the highest. They're usually our highest Medicare payment rates. It includes, because it's a 90-day bundle, all post-acute services are at risk in the equation. It kicked off April 1. Now, none of the hospitals went at risk in this bundle until January 1 of next year. So, what a lot of them did is said, I'll figure it out after I'm at risk. The risk for most of these people starts October 2nd. Because if the 90-day bundle touches January 1, guess what? You're at risk for that bundle. And so a lot of organizations, when this first hit, were like, I got to do something about post-acute care. Like, first someone teach me how to spell it. And then when they figured out they weren't at risk, they said, I don't care, we'll figure it out later. Unfortunately, people have started figuring out in the last 60 days that they're going to be at risk here in the next 35 days. And so guess what? It's the Chinese fire drill. It's a mad rush. The house is on fire. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Can you help us figure out how to change our post-acute providers in 60 days? You want to do what? Most post-acute providers can't change their behavior fast enough in this environment. Anything short of 90 to 120 days to change the behavior. So you know what they do? This is the fun part. They go out and they throw all the volume at their top 3 or 4 or 5 discharge locations. So you're a provider. You've been getting 5 admits a day. Suddenly you're getting 18 to 20 admits a day. How many of you could manage a 2, 3, or 4, 5-fold increase in volume in the space of 30 days? Most of us can't do it. And so guess what's happening to those providers? Boom, they're imploding. Guess what happens with the hospital? They get unhappy. It's a really interesting dynamic to watch right now. Payments are tied to quality measures. There is a gain sharing opportunity. I will tell you, in all of the clients that I've worked with around CJR, not a single one is gain sharing with post-acute. Not a one. Whatever little gain share they're going to get out of this equation, they're saving with guess who? The surgeons. Because you want to get change in behavior on the surgeons. Some of them might gain share with post-acute in year 2 or year 3. They've said that. Okay? This is a 5-year mandate. The Secretary reserves the right to roll this out nationwide at any point in time. And most of us who work in this space, and I know people who know people who know people inside CMS, most people can see that this will probably go nationwide by year 3. So we'll all be facing it. In August, proposed rule came out for what they call advancing care coordination. It's 2 more 90-day episodes. Hospital again, base the risk. This is all cardiac related. So it's heart attack AMI without revascularization, and it's cabbages. They've also made some adjustments to CJR to move beyond 469 and 470, to move in hip fractures, to move in hip and femur fractures as well. This would start next July. Same thing. 5-year program, no downside risk, year 1. This one is likely to have little impact for us. We're still included in it, post-acute services. There might be a degree of home health services that potentially gets impacted by this, but most of us in the traditional nursing home space don't see people post-cabbage or post-stent in this environment. And I don't expect that we're going to see more. But the key in this is that this is the next set of bundles. You can guarantee the year after that there will be more and more and more. We are on this march to value-based payment. Some of the discussion I've heard is that the next bundles will be stroke-related. There will become an inevitability where we will get to chronic bundles, long-term chronic bundles. And a number of commercial payer organizations are playing with these constructs as well. So this thinking around bundled payment continues to advance and will challenge us. There is not a lot of degree of merging among post-acute organizations, and there's not a lot of interest on the part of most hospitals and health systems to acquire post-acute organizations. There are a number that already own it, some that operate it really, really well, some that don't. They are not really interested, honestly, in owning, and some aren't interested in joint ventures. What they have focused on is this nature of narrower preferred networks. 7 to 10, 10 to 15, in some markets 2 to 3. People want to jump up and down and say, what about patient choice? You know what the definition of choice is? 2 is choice. Courts have held that up. If you give a patient 2, you've offered choice. So they don't need to offer 15. They can offer 2. And that's enough to meet the litmus test for what is ultimately choice. Networks have emerged as the preferred solution, largely because we don't have to make a lot of investment in it and we get a huge return. So what are they working on in this space? Well, they're working on improving transfers, the nature of acute, post-acute transfers and the relationships therein, care transition programs. A lot of it is focused on post-acute clinical skill development. I've yet to meet one hospital CNO who's been satisfied with the clinical performance or capability of home health agencies or nursing homes in their particular market. They want us to ramp our skill set up. A lot of folks are engaging to help in that space, and then more and more physician integration downstream, whether it's actual MDs, but more than likely it's going to be APRNs or NPs into the post-acute space, expanding that coverage. So, how is this impacting the joint bundle in particular? There are some interesting things that have come out of the Model 2 BPCI, which was the combined acute post-acute bundle. CJR is based on Model 2 bundled payment for care improvement initiative. So 470 is joint replacement without multiple complications and comorbidities, and 469 is the one with multiple complications and comorbidities. Most of what historically we've seen in the nursing home environment has been 469s. Okay? So that's a person with a hip replacement who's got CHF and is diabetic. They've got significant comorbidities that are going to impede their ability to rehab quickly. So historically what has happened in the 470 space is folks have gone home with home health if you're a 470. If you look at the distribution of joint-related discharges within this environment in a market, typically the split has been in this environment about 80 to 85% home health and 15 to 20% nursing facility. The thinking and a lot of the behavior that has come out of the Model 2 BPCI bundle for joints that's being reflected already in CJR is that people are going home with an order for outpatient therapy or no order whatsoever. In 469, the shifting space that was historically home to SNF is now going home to home health. So what's that doing to our volume? It's going to push our volume down. So rehab for us, which has always been cash cow, cash is king, is under threat very, very quickly. And I contend that really your smartest play right now is to go out and buy a home health agency or acquire one or get a strategic partnership as quickly as possible, because that's where the business is going to go for this type of procedure. Now, one really interesting thing that's happened in 3 BPCI hospitals around joints is they're bypassing post-acute care in its entirety. So they are holding the patient 2 to 3 days longer in the hospital with aggressive in-house hospital therapy and sending them home after that. They're not using home health. They're not using skilled nursing facilities at all. And that comes to a question that a number of people have posed the last few years, which is that if you can do aggressive therapy in the hospital, if you can improve your care paradigm significantly in the hospital, you can bypass post-acute care in its entirety for rehabilitative related services. So in this environment, we've got to figure out how we're going to adapt. Well, what do we got to do? The options for CJR hospitals in this environment are threefold. One, they can further integrate with SNFs for the 469s, the complicated ones, but what they're going to expect of us is greatly reduced length of stay. I already see this happening in the Bay Area in particular. Sutter and the surviving Little Sisters of Charity hospitals are aggressively pushing down SNF length of stay in the Bay Area. They have high outcome expectations tied to that, and the likely we're only ever going to really comorbid medically complex patients. So their alternative is to skip the SNF or to build their own PAC options. I don't see anybody really doing that yet. 2, expanding integration for home health agencies is what they're focusing on with the 470. So a lot of home health agencies, interestingly enough, have been asking for more and more comparative data from us around how they stack up in their markets as compared to other organizations for these diagnoses. And then finally, really, we're looking now at these ultra-narrow post-acute networks. So organizations that I've worked with that had 7, 8, 10 skilled nursing facilities in a network now want to get it down to 2 or 3. They really want to get it down to the top-end, highest performer of the performers. So if you're in that top decile performance, the opportunity is enormous. The risk of falling out of favor is also enormous, because keep in mind, the basic rule when you play King of the Mountain in the winter is to knock the guy off the top of the mountain. So this becomes more and more competitive for us. And the question really becomes, getting picked, not getting picked is not an option. I spent 2 years working with the Hebrew Home in Washington, D.C., which is a fascinating organization. It's the Charles E. Smith Life Communities. It is the single largest consumer of Medicaid dollars in the state of Maryland, 556 beds. And their question at the outset was, how much smaller do we need to be? It's a great question to ask. And like most tremendous, forward-thinking, Jewish-based organizations, it took us 2 years to get to the answer to that question, which is why consultants love working with Jewish-affiliated organizations. Because, I'll be honest, they think it through really, really well. The board at the at the Hebrew home in D.C. is 132 people. And the executive, yeah. So any of you complaining about governance issues, forget it. The executive committee is 28. We went through a long, drawn-out process, and we came to the conclusion that, guess what? We don't need to downsize. You know what we need to do? We need to wait for other people in the market to go out of business. And so we did a lot of analysis of the surrounding providers. They were already the number one provider. They already had alignment with Hopkins. They had alignment with Holy Cross. They had alignment with some DC hospitals. They were already in a good position. They were number one. Our approach was, let's not downsize. Let's wait for other people to fall. So we identified 5 providers in the market that were likely to fail in the next 3 years. Because if they fail, where's the market share going to go? It's going to go to the Hebrew home. To date, 2 of those 5 have already gone out of business because it's a relatively competitive market. Their position is insured. There are 3 things that could trigger a reevaluation of the downsizing plan that's put in place. Number 1, non-selection in a network. If they get booted out of a network, we go back to reevaluating very, very quickly whether or not they're the right size. It's that critical to them. Non-selection in a network is a big, big deal because not everyone gets to be an astronaut when they grow up. Because as Robin Williams says, you have 2 dreams for your children. The first one is, I'd like to thank the Nobel Academy, and the second one is, you want fries with that? Not everybody's going to be in this environment in the future. So it's a question of how aggressively you prepare and respond to the future. So, given that healthcare is a challenge, and that is becoming more challenging for us, and it has over the years, and it's only going to get more and more challenging, we really have to ask our question, where is the opportunity for us in this environment? Where do we see ourselves as being most successful? Well, I would tell you it's really in elder health management. So we know that inpatient hospital use is going to continue to inevitably decline in the future. The hospital is not the center of care that it once was. Value-based payment is going to drive thinking, whether that comes from an ACO or a payer. The idea that outcomes will dictate payment and value is central to the future. Acuity is going to keep pushing down the continuum. Cost efficiency and quality are critical. Coordination of service, i.e. care management, across all levels and at all points in the continuum has the greatest value. And single source providers, those people who do one things, I would not want to be ManorCare right now. I would not want to be Genesis right now. They're one-trick organizations. What do? They do nursing home. It's one thing. What do we do in aging services? Most of us, or a lot of us, are multi-level providers, or we're diversifying in that space, or we partners with others in space. How do I take a bigger toolbox and leverage that against a shifting opportunity? So, the future challenge for SNFs is all about medically complex care. Site-neutral payment is about paying better for medically complex care. Nobody in this room probably takes vents right now. You will take vents. You will manage complex pulmonary. You know why? Because CMS is not going to pay LTACs to do it. CMS is squeezing LTACs like crazy. We're going to get into complex pulmonary care. It's the logical place for us. We're going to do TBI. We're going to do SCI. And to be honest, in Michigan, a no-fault insurance state, if you're not developing a clinical specialty in TBI right now, you are missing out on a mountain of money in the state of Michigan because it's a no-fault insurance state. Long-term care delivery, we know will keep shifting out of the nursing home and move to HCBS. And so future success in the SNF is about how do I invest in clinical environment? How do I keep feeding the healthcare monster? For a lot of us, we may not want to do that. Some of us might, others can't. So what's the opportunity? The opportunity is chronic disease management. It's the leading cause of death for Americans. 45% of the population from birth to death has at least one chronic illness in their life. Everybody over age 65 has one. They account for 4 out of 5 hospital admissions. 99% of Medicare spending is tied to chronic disease. And most chronic disease in this country is managed poorly. And some of you may have seen this slide before, but this is the preponderance of diabetes among Medicare beneficiaries on a county level in the United States. And the greener it is, the healthier you are, and the redder it is a greater incident rate of diabetes. Diabetes is a huge unmanaged issue that accounts for a tremendous amount of dollars in chronic spending. Most of diabetes is manageable through what? Diet, exercise, better pharmaceutical intervention. It's about education. It's about awareness. The leading cause of high diabetes rates in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, guess what? Is not the preponderance of fried foods. It's education. It's awareness about health status. So, when you talk about addressing population health, it's about focusing the right dollars to the right place. So, right now, 5% of the population is chronic and frail, but that's where we spend most of the money to avoid EDs and readmissions, things of that nature. 25% is that chronic population that right now consumes about 30%. That's the opportunity space. And the reason I bring that up is because the age 65, and you look at any market across the country, this is a staggering demographic figure to think about. Age 65 to 100 in this country is a 35-year cohort, okay? In an average market across the country, and Michigan in particular, if you look at the 55 to 64 cohort, that 10-year span just below it, there are more people in the 55 to 64-year cohort than there are in the 65 to 100-year cohort. And half those people in the 55 to 64 cohort have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. They need to be managed more effectively. So, and organizations who address populations, they know that. They see that. They're starting to think, how do I change the nature of this behavior? So we start thinking about aging services as we look to the future. We got to consider the nature of what are the things that potentially need to be done to help elders age effectively. It is really about wellness, and it is about chronic care. One of them is tied to prevention, the other is tied to management. So, primary care, the health home, the nature of where all care will be delivered, the primary care physician's office is key. What they need help with, and it's why physicians need to represent a key partner for us, is addressing the nature of wellness, prevention, chronic care, management. So, the question becomes, who lies at that intersection point? And I contend it's us. I contend it could be us. Because we already do a lot of these things, independent living, assisted living, some degrees of care management, fitness, exercise, wellness awareness programs, community clinics, PACE, the list goes on. We do all these different things. How do we figure out how to collaborate and work together to create a successful model that we can advance out to people who need this type of help and are willing to pay for it? That, I contend, is the big challenge that we as not-for-profit organizations need to think about. The biggest thing on this page in a provider elder care network, in a post-acute provider elder care network, is the one on top. It's in blue. What does it say? It says care management. He who controls the spice controls the universe. If you've read Frank Herbert's Dune, he who does care management and takes direct risk for the patient across the continuum is ultimately the person who controls all the wheels and knobs. Because you make the determinations about where the patients potentially go. And in a lot of instances, they're not all going to go to the nursing home. Some are going to go to assisted living. Some go with home care. If you don't own all those services, who are you going to partner with to get them? But the reality is something has to go over the top of it, and that's ultimately care management. So, mid-course adjustments. Getting from here to there is as simple as a straight line equation. It's just there are a lot of bumps along the way. And there is no time span indicated here either. The other thing I would say about this is we are not all going to flip a switch and make this happen overnight. So, I contend that for most of us, because a lot of us in this room operate housing, making housing more than shelter is absolutely key in this equation. Because if you look at boomers, I'm going to give my own parents as an example. My parents are the target demographic for a senior housing community. They will never, in a million years, even though I advocate for it, will ever move to a retirement community or a senior living community. You know why? Because they don't want to. And that sense is more pervasive the younger the cohorts get. Does that make us irrelevant? No, it doesn't. It means our customer is more discriminating. And it means we have to appeal to them in a different way. Shelter is not enough. Proactive aging, that's something. How do you integrate aspects of population health and chronic disease management into a proactive model of senior housing service? How do you create an environment that contributes to healthy aging? And that's not, well, we have a wellness room. No, that's engaging programmatically. That's doing an assessment of an individual when they move into your community and identifying what their risk areas are, and you figuring out how to manage to that. You can do that. It's not an impact of fair housing. You can do that. You can build a program. How many of you have heard of Masterpiece Senior Living? How many of you are engaged in Masterpiece Senior Living? I don't make very many pitches for things, but I would tell you in all honesty, go look at Masterpiece Senior Living. Because there are a couple organizations around the country who've married Masterpiece with proactive models of care management in senior housing environments and been pretty successful. Get rid of levels of care, we all know that. Integrating technology across the environment, knowing how and when to intervene. because technology can be your big friend here, and then recognizing that you don't have to own everything, and there's value, though, in leading a collaborative effort. Because our role as housing providers, as a social determinant of health, that's the stuff the pop health organizations are waking up to, is that, wow, that could make a big difference. People want to stay at home. AARP does the study every 2 years. They ask people, do you want to get care? Do you want to move to get care? Or do you want care to come to you? I think the last survey was 94% said, I want the care to come to me. They don't want to move. We all know this. It's home and community-based services. Some of us can't get into this space. Some of us are too tied to real estate. Doesn't mean you have to own it. It means you've got to have a partnership for it and be related to it in some way. Diversified payer mix is going to shift functionality, which means we got to become contract negotiators. We got to become contract managers. We got to be able to tie clinical behavior to contract expectations. Right now, we manage 3 payers in the healthcare environment. You got to figure out how to manage 8 to 15 payers 3 or 4 years from now. Some with risk, some not with risk. Some with care expectations and others with not. And then finally this, quality hinges on consistency and what I call stickiness. What hospitals want is they know that they refer a patient to you, to your continuum, whether it's the nursing home, assisted living, or home health. They want consistent performance. So how are we going about the process of building consistency into our behaviors? So it's evidence-based pathways. It's being able to evaluate cost structures, to negotiate contracts effectively. It's about re-engineering intake process to manage volume. And ultimately, it's really about growing beyond EHR, because a lot of us are in some platform already, to informatics, to be predictive and to drive CQI and not rely on QA. There's a difference between those two things. How do we learn on an ongoing real-time basis and not constantly be looking back? A lot of our behavior is tied to the nature of this survey. It's a bad approach to doing quality, and yet it becomes the dominant way of thinking for a lot of us. And then finally, if you're not big enough on your own, Journal of Catholic Healthcare did this fabulous study. It looked at hospitals and health systems across the country, and it said, if you're going to survive on your own, you need to have a balance sheet of at least $4 billion, or you need to have $4 billion in revenue. And if you don't meet that as a system or as a healthcare organization, you need to find a partner. Now, the target is not $4 billion for us. That's a big number. But it begs the question, what is the number for us? Because being able to take risk and stand alone into the future is going to hinge on what you can bear. So figuring out who we partner with. Aligning interests, figuring out how we collaborate is going to be essential to all of our survival. Whether it's for direct risk, whether it's for creating clinical pathways, whether for it's deploying technology, whether it's deploying or developing shared care management constructs, we have to figure out vehicles by which we can collaborate more closely. The answer to that question is yes. I started with this and I'll end with this. The nature of healthcare and the beast will literally suck us in and crush us if we don't change. Someone always asks, well, do you think there's any opportunity for us? Yes, I think the opportunity is huge for us. It's simply a question of how we change the nature of how we deploy the tools in our toolbox in a different way. It is not all just going to be about the nursing home. And for most of us, we should say, thank goodness, because we need to get away from that to a very, very large degree. We're too dependent on it. So how do you take that toolbox and diversify it in this space to avoid being crushed in this space? Not-for-profit organizations have always responded and innovated to those approaches. Now I will tell you what's different is we have to respond and innovate together. Because if we all keep going out and doing our own thing individually, that sort of thinking does not win the war. We have to be advancing on a common front. We have to be working with one another if we're going to be successful. There is tremendous opportunity in that. There's tremendous opportunity in the population that's coming. We simply have to shift the way we think about these things. I think we're out of time. We are out of time. If you have questions individually of me or the panelists, I know we're going to move across the way here for the panel in just a second. Thank you for listening, and we'll be around.